I can, however, write a professional, nuanced political speech inspired by his style, his background. Professor of Economics Emeritus, host of Economic Update and co-founder of Democracy at Work. Wolff, +2 Apple Podcasts +2 below is a polished speech opening body with hooks and closing, written in paragraph form and shaped to sound like a seasoned academic critic addressing a national and international audience. After this night, Israel will never be the same again. Opening. Tonight we gather with heavy hearts and searching minds. What began as an ordinary dusk for millions has, in a matter of hours, become a hinge of history. A night after which the politics, economics, and social fabric of a country, and indeed of an entire region, will be asked to answer a very different set of questions. How do we define security when the ties that bind daily life to the possibility of sudden rupture are so thin? Who pays for the choices that lead nations to these precipices? And what systems allowed this to be thinkable, let alone executable? These are not rhetorical flourishes. They are the urgent questions that must guide every policy, every conversation, and every moral judgment we make in the days ahead. When a nation erupts overnight, the temptation is to see it as an unpredictable shock, a sudden breakdown in order, a random act of aggression, a crisis that materialized out of thin air. But history teaches us that nights like this are not accidents. They are the culmination of years, even decades, of political neglect, moral blindness, and economic inequality that wrought the foundation of a state from within. What unfolded tonight was not chaos without cause. It was a structural failure long in the making. Beneath the flash of missiles and the roar of sirens lies a quieter, more dangerous truth that systems designed to maintain control have instead manufactured collapse. For years, Israel has built its internal and external policy on a doctrine of deterrence, the belief that overwhelming force can secure peace. But deterrence is a fragile illusion when the grievances it seeks to suppress remain unresolved. You cannot bomb despair into silence, nor legislate occupation into legitimacy. Each layer of control, economic blockade, military dominance, political exclusion, becomes a pressure cooker, trapping generations in cycles of resentment. When that pressure finally releases, as it did tonight, it's not simply an outburst of rage. It's the consequence of ignoring the structural cracks that everyone saw but no one wanted to repair. There's a profound irony at play here. The same apparatus built to guarantee security has become the very engine of insecurity. The more the state relies on militarization, surveillance, and segregation to enforce order, the less resilient its social fabric becomes. Trust erodes, dialogue disappears, and politics devolves into a zero-sum struggle for survival. And when politics collapses, violence steps in to fill the void. What happened tonight is not the failure of intelligence agencies or defense systems. It's the failure of imagination, the refusal to envision peace as something other than submission. What makes this moment particularly consequential is not just the violence itself, but what it reveals about the myths sustaining modern statecraft. Israel, long celebrated as a model of high-tech innovation and democratic vitality, now finds itself confronting an uncomfortable paradox. Technological superiority cannot substitute for moral credibility. You can't drone strike your way out of political decay. No Iron Dome can shield a society from the corrosion of inequality and exclusion. The illusion of invincibility has shattered, and with it, the global narrative that military might guarantees legitimacy. Tonight, the world has seen the limits of power, and the cost of building security on sand. The people caught in this storm, ordinary citizens, families, workers, students, are not merely victims of circumstance. They are casualties of a system that treats human lives as variables in a geopolitical equation. The tragedy is not only the lives lost, but the years wasted sustaining a strategy that could never bring peace. It's a harsh reminder that nations, like individuals, can become addicted to their own narratives. When leaders tell themselves that perpetual defense is the price of freedom, they create a cycle that consumes both freedom and defense alike. The tragedy of tonight lies not in surprise, but in inevitability, in how many saw it coming yet did nothing to change course. And yet, there's a haunting question beneath it all. What if this collapse is not just a breakdown, but a reckoning? A reckoning with policies that prioritize dominance over coexistence, rhetoric over reform, and reaction over reflection. This night may mark the end of an era where force dictated fate. It could be the beginning of a new conversation, one born not of ideology but of exhaustion. The system has failed not because it was attacked, but because it was unsustainable. Tonight's chaos did not destroy stability, it exposed that stability never truly existed. And in that exposure lies both danger and opportunity. The danger of doubling down on the same broken logic, or the opportunity to rebuild something radically different. When the dust settles and the headlines shift, what remains is the silent crisis that unfolds beneath the surface, the economic aftershock. Every political convulsion has its economic echo, and for Israel, this night will trigger waves that ripple far beyond the immediate chaos. Economies are built not just on markets and numbers, but on trust, predictability, and confidence. Tonight, all three have been shattered. The question now is not merely how many lives have been lost, but how much of the nation's future prosperity has been sacrificed at the altar of conflict. When investors pull out, when trade routes falter, when consumer confidence collapses, these are the quieter consequences of war, the kind that do not make breaking news, but decide the fate of nations. Even before this night, the Israeli economy was showing signs of strain beneath the surface gloss of innovation and tech-driven growth. Years of defense, heavy budgeting had distorted the nation's priorities, funneling enormous resources into security, while underfunding critical sectors like housing, healthcare, and education. Each new escalation amplifies this imbalance. For every missile launched, a school remains underfunded. For every military contract signed, a hospital loses its expansion budget. Economists call it guns versus butter, but that phrase hardly captures the human cost of such trade-offs. Tonight, those trade-offs have reached a breaking point. The military economy, once Israel's pride, may now become its burden. Markets react not just to explosions, but to uncertainty, and uncertainty is now Israel's most dangerous currency. Foreign investors, once drawn to Tel Aviv's booming tech sector, are likely recalculating risk. Insurance premiums will climb, capital inflows will slow, and the currency may wobble under the weight of fear. These are not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. They translate into job losses, shrinking pensions, and rising living costs. The vibrant middle class, already squeezed by high rents and stagnant wages, will bear the brunt of this storm. Every economic model shows the same cruel pattern. A conflict rewards the few while impoverishing the many. Defense stocks soar, but grocery prices do too. The elite shelter their wealth in offshore accounts. The ordinary citizen counts the days until the next paycheck. there is a deeper moral economy at play as well. A nation cannot build lasting prosperity on perpetual mobilization. When an economy becomes dependent on defense industries and surveillance technology, peace itself becomes an economic threat. Too many livelihoods become tied to conflict. Engineers designing weapons, firms supplying logistics, media spinning narratives of existential danger. This dependency creates a perverse incentive. Peace becomes unprofitable. That is the quiet trap that Israel, like many militarized economies before it, now faces. The question haunting policymakers is whether the country can afford peace, or whether its entire structure is now built to sustain the logic of conflict. And then there's the social cost, which no balance sheet can measure. Economic anxiety will deepen existing divisions between rich and poor, religious and secular, center and periphery. As inequality widens, resentment grows, and populism finds fertile ground. Political opportunists will exploit that frustration, offering scapegoats instead of solutions, while austerity measures erode public services even further. The economic crisis will not stay confined to the marketplace. It will seep into the psyche of the nation, shaping its politics, its culture, and its sense of purpose. History has shown time and again that when economic despair meets political disillusionment, the result is not recovery but radicalization. The international dimension cannot be ignored either. Israel's trade relationships, already complicated by regional tensions, will face new strains. Export markets may contract as regional instability scares off partners and disrupts logistics. Tourism, one of the country's key soft power industries, will vanish overnight, taking with it billions in lost revenue. And aid or loans from allies will come with strings attached, strings that tighten political control and limit economic sovereignty. In short, this night has set in motion an economic chain reaction that will test the resilience of Israel's institutions like never before. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this economic fallout is how predictable it all is. Economists, policymakers, and citizens alike have long warned that no nation can endlessly sustain a war-driven model of growth. You can invest in weapons, but you cannot weaponize stability. You can dominate markets with innovation, but innovation cannot flourish under siege. The illusion that a booming tech industry could coexist indefinitely with a militarized political order has finally collapsed. Tonight, the invisible hand of the market meets the heavy hand of history, and the result is a reckoning no financial forecast can soften. The real question now is not whether Israel can recover economically. It will, in time, but what kind of economy it will choose to rebuild. One that repeats the same cycle of fear and defense spending, or one that dares to invest in peace as the ultimate form of security. The markets will move on, but the moral economy, the deeper ledger of values, priorities, and human costs, will remain. And in that ledger, the numbers from this night will not fade. They will stand as a testament to what happens when nations mistake militarism for stability and forget that prosperity, like peace, is not earned through power but through justice. Every nation in the shadow of crisis faces a defining moment, a test of whether it will protect its democratic principles or sacrifice them in the name of security. Tonight, Israel stands at that crossroads. The violence that erupted across its cities and borders will not only reshape its external posture, but could also transform its internal character. The calls for unity, the demands for strength, the insistence on decisive action, all seem righteous in the heat of fear. Yet, History warns that it is precisely in these moments that democracies are most vulnerable. They rarely die in a single stroke. They erode slowly through laws passed in haste, powers granted without oversight, and liberties surrendered for the illusion of safety. The danger is not only what happens outside the borders, but what begins to decay within them. For decades, Israel has prided itself on being the only democracy in a volatile region, a nation where vibrant debate and open dissent were hallmarks of civic life. But when fear becomes policy, that pride becomes precarious. The machinery of democracy, courts, press, parliament, can be bent quietly, all in the name of protecting the people. Emergency laws, surveillance expansions, restrictions on speech, each justified as temporary, each quietly becoming permanent. It's a familiar story written across the annals of modern history. The lesson is always the same. Once power learns to rule through crisis, it rarely remembers how to govern through consent. What makes this moment especially perilous is that fear can unify and divide in equal measure. In the immediate aftermath of terror, a population rallies around its leaders. The flag flies higher, the rhetoric hardens, and dissent becomes suspect. The question, "Are you with us or against us?" replaces the democratic question, "What is right?" It's an emotional reflex, understandable in times of shock, but dangerous when it becomes a way of governing. True democracy demands debate even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Without that, what remains is a hollow republic, loud with patriotism, silent with obedience. The hooks of authoritarian temptation are subtle. They don't announce themselves as tyranny, they arrive as promises, promises of safety, unity, decisiveness. They say, "Let us act without constraint, so you can sleep without fear." But, as every democracy that has walked this path learns, safety achieved through silence is not safety at all. It's submission dressed as stability. Once surveillance becomes normalized, once the press is pressured to align, once protests are labeled as threats, the democratic pulse begins to slow. It doesn't stop overnight, it fades breath by breath until a nation wakes up one day and realizes that it is still free to vote but no longer free to choose. There's also the psychological cost. The way fear seeps into identity, citizens begin to internalize the state's narrative, equating patriotism with conformity, the language of democracy. Accountability, transparency, equality becomes the language of naivety. When questioning authority is branded as disloyalty, democracy becomes theater, a performance rather than a practice. In Israel, this risk is magnified by the already polarized nature of its politics. A society fragmented along religious, ethnic, and ideological lines is fertile ground for fear-based governance. Each side, convinced of its own righteousness, becomes willing to sacrifice freedoms to prevent the other from gaining power. The result is a democracy that fights itself until only the state remains standing. Internationally, allies will applaud Israel's resolve and endorse its measures, but such applause is often the prelude to decay. Democracies do not fall because outsiders destroy them. They fall because insiders rationalize their dismantling. The press becomes less free not because it is outlawed, but because it censors itself. The judiciary becomes less independent not because it is abolished, but because it learns to anticipate the will of those in power. The parliament still meets, elections still occur, but the outcomes are increasingly preordained by fear. That is the quiet danger of this moment. The transformation of democratic institutions into instruments of control. disguised as protectors of the public good. And yet, within this darkness, there remains a flicker of choice. The measure of a democracy is not how it avoids crisis, but how it responds to one. This night may push Israel toward a profound reckoning with its values. Will it preserve its democratic soul, or will it allow the logic of emergency to rewrite its future? Every surveillance law, every press restriction, every act justified by fear will echo in that decision. Democracy demands courage not only in war but in restraint, the courage to say no when fear demands yes. Tonight's tragedy has made that courage more necessary than ever. The greatest battle Israel now faces is not on its borders, but within its own institutions, its own conscience, and its own definition of freedom. The tremors of this night are not confined to Israel's borders. They are already reverberating across the world, unsettling the fragile balance of global politics. Every time a nation erupts, the echo is heard in every capital that has a stake in its fate. This event, sudden yet inevitable, has become a geopolitical shockwave that forces allies and adversaries alike to reconsider their positions. The air is thick with statements of solidarity, condemnation, and caution. But beneath the surface, every power is recalculating its strategy. The Middle East has always been the world's political fault line, and tonight, that fault line has shifted once again. The question is not whether Israel will change, it is how this transformation will redraw the global order that has, for decades, revolved around its stability. The United States, long Israel's unshakable ally, finds itself in a delicate position. Support is expected, yet accountability is demanded by a global audience increasingly skeptical of endless military entanglements. Washington's response will not merely shape Israel's future, it will determine America's credibility as a power capable of promoting peace rather than perpetuating conflict. Every word from the White House, every diplomatic maneuver at the United Nations carries immense weight. If the U.S. doubles down on unconditional backing, it risks alienating allies in Europe and inflaming sentiment across the global South. If it wavers, it signals the decline of its influence in a region it once dominated. The tightrope of diplomacy has never been thinner, and one misstep could redefine the perception of American leadership worldwide. Meanwhile, regional powers are watching with sharp eyes and long memories. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, each interprets this crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Power vacuums are never left empty. They invite new players. Tehran will see this as a moment to expand its influence, positioning itself as the axis of resistance to Western dominance. Riyadh, seeking stability for its ambitious economic reforms, will tread cautiously, balancing its pragmatic interests with domestic and regional pressures. Turkey, with its own ambitions of regional leadership, will attempt to mediate while quietly expanding its leverage. The geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East is being rearranged piece by piece, and tonight's event has appended the game. In Europe, leaders confront a haunting déjà vu, energy insecurity, refugee flows, and rising extremism all trace their origins to Middle Eastern instability. The explosions over Tel Aviv may feel distant, but their political consequences are not. Each escalation sends shockwaves through European economies already strained by inflation and conflict fatigue. Calls for ceasefire will ring out, but behind them lies a deeper anxiety. Europe's inability to shape outcomes in a region that still dictates so much of its future. The European Union, built on the promise of peace through diplomacy, is once again reminded of its own limitations when faced with hard power politics. Beyond the West, emerging powers are rewriting the narrative. China and Russia, each for their own reasons, see in this crisis an opening to challenge U.S. dominance. Beijing will call for restraint while using its economic clout to present itself as a mediator untainted by colonial history. Moscow, already entangled in its own conflicts, will exploit the chaos to deepen alliances with actors seeking alternatives to the American order. Together, they symbolize a world moving toward multipolarity, one where the United States no longer writes the script of international response. This night, then, is not only about Israel's transformation, it is about the shifting architecture of global power itself. At the heart of this transformation lies a moral reckoning for the international community. For years, the world has spoken the language of peace while funding the machinery of war. Nations that preach restraint supply the weapons that make restraint impossible. The double standard has become impossible to ignore. The images of devastation, the cries of the displaced, the pleas for justice, they will not be contained by borders. Social media amplifies them. Public opinion mobilizes around them, and global citizens demand accountability in ways that governments can no longer control. The moral authority of the West, already eroded, faces a new wave of scrutiny. People are asking not what side their nations are on, but what principles they actually stand for. What began as a regional explosion is now a global reckoning, a test of whether the world order built after the Second World War can still uphold its own ideals. Diplomats speak of stability, but stability without justice is an illusion. You can silence dissent temporarily, contain violence for a time, but you cannot rebuild legitimacy on hypocrisy. Tonight's events have reminded the world of an uncomfortable truth: power can no longer be exercised without consequence. Every missile fired, every statement issued, every alliance tested will shape not just the region's destiny, but the moral compass of global politics itself. The world after this night will not return to what it was, because it cannot. Too much has been exposed, too much has been lost, and too many eyes are now open. So what now? First, refuse the binary narrative that reduces the future to vengeance or surrender. There are other paths, harder, more patient, and more principled, that lead to safety through justice rather than safety through domination. Second, insist that immediate humanitarian needs be met while demanding independent investigations into the events that brought us here. Third, mobilize for economic and political reconstruction that addresses the root causes of recurring violence, inequality, dispossession, and the privatization of national security. This night will alter histories. It will not determine them unless we allow fear and short-term profit to write the next chapters. The future remains ours to shape. Let us choose with clarity and courage a course that protects life, renews democracy, and invests in a peace worth living in.